Sarah Calloway was 33 years old and utterly ruined. Standing at the edge of a gravel road with nothing left in the world but a carpet bag, a torn shawl, and the bitter taste of betrayal still fresh on her tongue. It was her late husband's own brother, a calculating merchant named Silas Pruitt, who had driven her from the homestead she and her husband had built with their own hands, brandishing a forged note of debt that no honest judge should ever have honored. All Sarah possessed after the court stripped her bare was $4.60 wrapped in a handkerchief. And with it she made a decision the whole town of Hollow Pine would call the final proof of her madness. She paid $2 for the crossing rights to the condemned gray bridge and the crumbling trapper's cabin that stood abandoned on the far side of Widow's Gorge, a stretch of land no living soul had set foot on in 80 years. The townsfolk laughed as she walked toward the rotted planks that swayed above the roaring river below, certain she would either turn back in terror or plunge to her death like the family who perished there generations before. Yet hidden within the silent, forgotten cabin across that ancient, Forbidden's bridge lay a secret sealed away for 8 long decades, one that would not only settle the score against the man who destroyed her, but would return to an entire valley of struggling families the birthright that had been stolen from them in darkness. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Sarah Calloway, if you are watching tonight from a corner of the world that others have written off as broken or forgotten. Tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Long before the gorge swallowed the old road, and long before the bridge became a thing that mothers warned their children away from, the valley of Hollow Pine had been a gentler place, cupped between 2 long ridges of ponderosa pine in the Oregon Territory, its bottomland thick with wild grasses and its river running fast and clean over beds of gray stone. Sarah had been born in that valley to a stonemason named Thomas Calloway and his wife Ruth, and from her earliest years she had learned that a thing's worth was rarely printed on its face. Her father built chimneys and foundations for half the families in 3 counties, and he taught his daughter, in that quiet, patient way fathers sometimes have with a child who listens harder than she speaks, that the strongest stone in any wall was often the ugliest one, the one nobody wanted to set at the front where folks could see it. He would run his rough thumb along a chipped, lopsided rock plucked from the riverbed and tell her that character, whether in stone or in people, showed itself only under pressure, and that the smooth, pretty ones on top of the pile were rarely the ones holding the weight. Sarah grew into a woman who noticed things other people overlooked, the hairline crack in a beam before it gave way, the flicker of dishonesty behind a merchant's friendly greeting, the particular hush that fell over a room when someone was about to lie. She was not loud, and she was not celebrated for her wit at socials, but there was a steadiness to her that older women in town respected and younger women quietly envied, a sense that whatever storm came, Sarah Calloway would still be standing when the sky cleared. She married young, at 19, to a gentle, broad-shouldered farmer named Daniel Calloway, who happened to share her family name, though they were not kin. A coincidence the whole valley found endlessly amusing at their wedding supper. Daniel had a quiet laugh and an unhurried way of working a field, and he adored Sarah with the sort of steady devotion that never needed to announce itself. Together they built a modest but proud homestead on 40 acres at the northern edge of the valley, where Daniel raised wheat and a small herd of cattle, and Sarah kept a garden so bountiful that neighbors joked the soil itself seemed to lean toward her hands. They were never wealthy, but they were never wanting either, and their door was always open to a traveler needing a meal or a widow needing a spare bolt of cloth for mourning clothes. It was during those years that Sarah's father, before his own passing, told her something she would carry the rest of her life, that the old crossing at Widow's Gorge, condemned since before either of them were born, held more history than the town cared to remember, and that her grandfather, a young surveyor's assistant back when the valley was first charted, had once spoken of papers hidden away on the far side that were never meant to be lost. It was a passing remark, spoken almost as legend. The kind of story old men tell by firelight. And Sarah tucked it away without much thought, never guessing how it would one day become the center of her life. Daniel and Sarah's happiness lasted 12 quiet years, through droughts and good harvests alike, until the autumn fever came sweeping down from the northern logging camps and took hold of half the valley within a single month. Daniel fell ill on a Tuesday and was gone by the following week, and Sarah nursed him through nights so cold and so long that she later could not remember eating or sleeping through any of them. Only the sound of his breathing growing shallower until at last it stopped altogether. She buried her husband on a gray October morning with only a handful of neighbors present, and she did not weep before them, holding her grief the way her father had taught her to hold a heavy stone, close to the chest and braced against the leg so it would not topple her. She believed, in the raw fog of those early weeks of widowhood, that the worst had already happened to her, that whatever came next could not possibly be crueler than the silence in her own house each evening. She was wrong, and the cruelty that followed wore the face of family. Silas Pruitt was Daniel's younger brother, a man who had left Hollow Pine as a boy to make his fortune in the freight and lending business in the county seat, and who returned to the valley only rarely, always dressed a shade too finely for a farming town, always smelling faintly of cigar smoke and hair oil. He had never much cared for his brother's plain, hard-working life, and he had certainly never cared for Sarah, whom he privately considered an obstacle standing between himself and whatever he believed the Calloway name was worth. Within 2 months of Daniel's death, Silas arrived at the homestead with a lawyer, a stack of papers, and a story that Daniel had, in the final desperate year of a bad harvest, borrowed heavily against the farm to cover a failed cattle deal, signing the land itself over as collateral in the event the debt went unpaid. Sarah stared at the signature at the bottom of the note, a signature that mimicked her husband's hand closely enough to fool a distracted eye, but not closely enough to fool a woman who had watched him write his name 1,000 times across ledgers and letters. She said as much plainly and without hysterics. But the county judge who reviewed the case was an old business associate of Silas's freight company, and paper carried more weight in that courtroom than a widow's certainty. Within the month, the farm was seized, the cattle were driven off, and Sarah was given 2 hours to gather what she could carry before the new lock went onto the door her husband had built with his own hands. She left Hollow Pine's northern edge with a carpet bag, a shawl the color of rust that had belonged to her mother, and $4.60 that she had managed to hide in the lining of her boot before the appraisers arrived. She had no family left to turn to, no husband, no farm, and no legal recourse against a man with a judge in his pocket. And for the first time in her adult life, Sarah Calloway did not know what the next day would bring. She spent 3 nights sleeping in the loft of a sympathetic neighbor's barn, turning over in her mind every possibility available to a penniless widow in a small frontier town. And it was on the 3rd night, staring up at the rafters, that she remembered her father's old story about the crossing at Widow's Gorge and the papers her grandfather once spoke of, the Gray Bridge, as it was called by the handful of old-timers who still remembered its name, had spanned Widow's Gorge since the valley's earliest days, built by a stern, ambitious engineer named Elias Thorn, who had come west with grand plans of connecting Hollow Pine to the mining routes beyond the ridge. 80 years before Sarah's own troubles began, a violent spring flood had torn through the gorge, weakening the bridge's footings on the far side. And in the chaos of that same season, Thorn's own family, along with 2 of his surveying assistants, had vanished from the cabin they kept on the opposite bank, never to be seen again. Some said they had been swept away trying to shore up the bridge. Others whispered darker things about a dispute over the land grants Thorn had been surveying, and about men from a rival company who wanted his work stopped. Whatever the truth, the town declared the bridge unsafe. built a longer road around the northern bend of the gorge instead. And over the following decades, the crossing became something people simply stopped speaking of. A place children were warned from and adults quietly avoided. Until 80 years had passed and not a single living soul had set foot upon it. Asterisk. When Sarah went to the county land office to inquire, she discovered, to her mild astonishment, that the crossing rights to the bridge and the small parcel of land containing Thorn's abandoned cabin had never been formally claimed by anyone since the original disaster, the county having long ago written the property off as worthless and dangerous. The clerk, a bored young man who clearly thought Sarah's request eccentric at best, informed her she could purchase the crossing rights and the half-acre parcel for $2 even. Payment in full, no questions asked. Since no one in living memory had wanted it, and the county was glad to be rid of the liability on its books, Sarah handed over 2 of her precious dollars without hesitation, and the clerk shook his head as he stamped the deed, muttering that she was either the bravest woman in the territory or the most foolish, and that he supposed only time would tell which. Word spread through Hollow Pine within a day, and by evening half the town was chuckling over the widow Calloway's latest folly, certain she had simply lost her wits along with her home, throwing away good money on a bridge that would drop her straight into the river the moment she set her boot upon it. Sarah did not much care what the town said of her. She walked to the edge of the gorge the following morning with her father's old tools slung over her shoulder, tools she had managed to save from the estate before the sheriff's men carted everything else away, and she studied the bridge the way her father had taught her to study any structure before trusting her weight to it. The planks nearest her side of the gorge were rotted through in places, silvery gray and soft as old bread, but the great support beams beneath them, cut from heavy fir and anchored deep into the granite on both banks, were sounder than 80 years of neglect had any right to leave them. She spent the better part of 2 weeks replacing the worst of the decking with salvaged lumber she bartered for with the last of her coins and her own labor, working alone from dawn until the light failed her, testing each new plank with a stone before she dared test it with her own body. The valley watched her from a cautious distance, some out of concern, most out of morbid curiosity, waiting to see whether the widow would finish her repairs or simply disappear into the river the way Elias Thorn's family had disappeared 80 years before, on a cool September morning, with the mist still clinging low over the water. Sarah Calloway became the first person in 80 years to walk the full length of the gray bridge and set foot on the far side of Widow's Gorge. The ground there had gone wild and unclaimed for so long that it felt to her like stepping into another era entirely. Brambles and young pines grown up through what had once been a cleared yard, and standing at the center of it, half swallowed by ivy and moss, the small log cabin that had belonged to Elias Thorn. Its roof had partially collapsed under decades of snow, and its door hung crooked on a single rusted hinge. But the thick log walls, much like the bridge's beams, had endured far better than anyone would have expected. Sarah pushed the door inward with a groan of old wood and stepped into a room thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else beneath it. Something dry and papery that spoke of things kept sealed away from moisture for a very long time. The cabin's single room was sparse, holding only the bones of a rope bed, a collapsed table, and a stone hearth choked with the nests of decades of birds. But along the far wall, half hidden behind a fallen shelf, Sarah's eye caught the glint of a small brass hinge. She cleared away the debris to find a low iron-banded strongbox built directly into a recess in the log wall itself, clearly placed there with great deliberation rather than left behind by accident. The lock had rusted nearly solid, but Sarah worked at it patiently with her father's old chisel and a river stone for a hammer. The same careful, unhurried patience she had learned watching him mend broken wagon wheels as a girl. until at last the mechanism gave way with a groan and the lid creaked open on its ancient hinge. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, she found the first true clue to the mystery that would consume the following weeks of her life: a leather-bound field journal belonging to Elias Thorn himself. Its final entries dated the very week of the flood that supposedly claimed his family. And tucked between its pages, a folded letter addressed not to any government office, but to whoever might one day find it. Sarah sat on the cabin's dusty floor with the journal open across her knees and read Thorn's cramped, hurried handwriting by the thin light slanting through the broken roof. And what she found there made her blood run cold, even in the warmth of the September morning. Elias Thorn had not simply been surveying the valley for a mining route, as the town had always believed. He had been commissioned by the Territorial Land Office to complete an original survey establishing Hollow Pine and its surrounding basin as a protected settler's land grant, a legal designation that would have permanently barred large freight and lending companies from buying up the valley's farms through debt and foreclosure. In his final entries, written in a hand that grew increasingly shaky and afraid across the last several pages, Thorn described how a powerful freight company operating out of the county seat, one that stood to lose enormous profits if the valley's land could never be consolidated and resold, had sent men to intimidate him into abandoning the survey before it could be filed. When Thorn refused, insisting the completed grant documents were already on their way to the territorial capital by a separate courier, the freight company's agents had, according to Thorn's own trembling account, sabotaged the bridge's footings during a rainstorm to make his family's coming departure look like a tragic accident of nature, intending to silence him and destroy any remaining copies of the survey before it could ever take legal effect. Thorn had hidden the original master copy of the completed land grant, along with the letters proving the freight company's scheme, inside this very strong box, sealing it away and sending his family across the bridge one final time in the desperate hope they might reach safety before the men returned. A hope that the flood, whether natural or engineered, ultimately swallowed along with the crossing itself. The letter tucked inside the journal was addressed, in Thorn's own careful hand, to whatever honest soul might one day find the strength to cross the gorge again. And it named a freight company responsible for the scheme in plain, unflinching language: the Pruitt Freight and Lending Company, founded by a hard, ambitious young man named Silas Pruitt, whom Sarah recognized with a jolt as Silas Pruitt's own great-grandfather. The very company that had, 3 generations later, financed Silas's fraudulent claim against her own homestead had its roots in the same cold calculation that drowned Elias Thorn's family and buried an entire valley's legal protection beneath 80 years of silence and forgotten water. Sarah sat very still in that ruined cabin for a long while, the journal trembling slightly in her hands, understanding now that the crossing she had bought for $2 out of desperation held within it not merely her own vindication, but the means to undo generations of quiet theft against every family who had ever lost land to the Pruitt name. She spent the following days making careful copies of every page by lamplight, using ink and paper she bartered for with mending work in town, protecting the fragile originals from further damage while she planned her next move with the same deliberate patience her father had once used to test a beam before trusting his weight to it. She learned from the county archives, through careful and quiet inquiry that never once mentioned what she had found, that the original Territorial Land Office had indeed processed a partial settler's grant application decades ago for the Hollow Pine Basin, but that the file had been marked incomplete and closed when the final supporting survey documents never arrived. Precisely the documents Thorn had hidden away before his disappearance. If the original grant could be formally completed and filed even now, Sarah realized, It would retroactively establish that the entire valley's farmland had always been protected from precisely the kind of predatory debt seizure that had destroyed her own home, potentially unraveling not only Silas's forged claim against her but every questionable foreclosure the Pruitt company had executed in Hollow Pine for 3 generations. Word of Sarah's strange excursions across the once forbidden bridge eventually reached Silas Pruitt himself, who arrived in Hollow Pine within the week in a fine hired carriage, his easy smile thinner than usual as he pressed neighbors for details of what the widow had been doing on the far side of the gorge. When he confronted Sarah directly outside the general store, demanding to know what foolishness she was chasing now, she told him only that she had found some old family papers of interest and nothing more. Watching carefully as a flicker of genuine alarm crossed his composed features before he mastered it. Silas was no fool himself, and the mention of old papers from the Thorn cabin, a place his own family's business had quietly steered the town away from discussing for generations, was enough to send him hurrying back to the county seat to consult his own lawyers about how much of his family's history might still be buried in that gorge alongside Elias Thorn. Asterisk. The following weeks became a quiet, tense contest between the widow everyone had dismissed and the powerful freight company that had built its fortune on land it should never have been able to touch. Silas attempted first to have the crossing rights revoked, sending word to the county that the bridge remained a public hazard and ought to be condemned outright regardless of Sarah's paid deed. But the same young clerk who had sold her the parcel, now rather taken with the story of the widow who had crossed where no one else dared, quietly informed her of the attempt in time for her to file a formal protection request with the Territorial Land Office itself, citing the very grant application Thorn's documents proved had once been underway. Silas next tried gentler tactics, appearing at Sarah's rented room in town with an offer to buy back whatever papers she had found for a generous sum, framing it as a kindness to a struggling widow rather than the desperate bid it truly was. But Sarah declined with the same quiet steadiness she had shown her whole life, telling him only that some things were not hers to sell, since they belonged rightfully to the whole valley and not to any single person, himself included. When persuasion failed, whispers began circulating through town that the widow Calloway had gone truly mad, wandering forbidden ground and inventing wild stories to avoid facing the shame of losing her farm honestly. And for a time Sarah found herself more isolated in Hollow Pine than she had been in all her years of quiet grief, trusted by almost no one except the handful of families who had themselves lost land to the Pruitt COMPANY's aggressive lending practices over the years. It was one of those very families, the Hendersons, who had lost 40 acres to a suspiciously similar forged note 2 years before Sarah's own troubles began, who finally helped turn the tide in her favor, coming forward once they heard her story to say that their own signature on the Pruitt loan papers had never looked quite right to them either, though they had lacked the means or the standing to challenge it at the time. With their testimony added to her own, and with the copied pages of Thorn's journal and the original grant documents, now safely delivered by trusted courier to the Territorial Land Office in the capital, Sarah petitioned for an official territorial surveyor to be sent to Hollow Pine to review the case in full, a request that, given the gravity of what the documents alleged about sabotage and fraud spanning 3 generations, could not easily be ignored or buried by local influence alone. The territorial surveyor and an accompanying federal land agent arrived in Hollow Pine on a cold, bright morning in late October, and the whole town turned out along the main road to watch as Sarah Calloway, in her worn traveling coat with her mother's rust-colored shawl about her shoulders, walked forward to meet them with Thorn's original journal and the surviving fragments of the completed land grant carried carefully in a satchel at her side. Silas Pruitt arrived shortly after with his own lawyers in tow, his composure cracking visibly for the first time in public as the federal agent began reading aloud from Thorn's account of sabotage and the freight company's decades-old scheme to keep the valley's land unprotected and open to seizure. The crowd that had once laughed at the widow's foolish $2 purchase now stood in stunned, growing silence as the full weight of what she had uncovered settled over them. Farmer after farmer beginning to understand that the notes and foreclosures that had haunted their families for years might never have held any legal power at all, had the truth not been drowned alongside Elias Thorn 80 years before, the federal land agent. After several days of careful review comparing Thorn's original survey markers against the current county boundary records, confirmed what Sarah had already come to believe in her heart. The original settlers' land grant for the Hollow Pine Basin had indeed been legitimately completed and merely awaited final filing at the time of Thorn's disappearance. And under territorial law, a grant so thoroughly documented and only prevented from filing by proven interference could still be honored retroactively once the true circumstances came to light. The ruling that followed struck through the valley like the flood that had once torn the old bridge apart, invalidating decades of foreclosures the Pruitt Company had executed against Hollow Pine farms under debt terms that never should have applied to protected settler land in the first place. Sarah's own forged note against her homestead chief among them. Silas Pruitt, faced with federal fraud charges stemming directly from his family company's decades of illegal seizures and the now undeniable evidence of his great-grandfather's role in Thorn's death, was arrested within the month, his fine carriage and easy smile doing nothing to shield him from a reckoning 3 generations in the making. Sarah did not ask for vengeance beyond what justice itself demanded, and she certainly did not seek to enrich herself from what she had found, choosing instead to work alongside the returning federal agent to see that every family who had lost land to the Pruitt Company's fraudulent claims received their rightful acres back under the protection of the newly filed grant. She reclaimed her own homestead at the valley's northern edge, restoring Daniel's chimney and mending the door the sheriff's men had once locked against her. But she also insisted on keeping the small half-acre parcel across the Gray Bridge, quietly repairing Elias Thorn's cabin herself over the following spring and placing a modest marker near its door honoring the surveyor and his family, who had given their lives protecting a promise they never lived to see fulfilled. By the following summer, the Gray Bridge that no one had dared cross for 80 years had become something else entirely in the eyes of Hollow Pine. No longer a place of old fear, but a quiet monument to what patience and courage could uncover even in the most forgotten corners of a forgotten world. Families who had spent years believing their land was owned by luck alone now understood it was protected by law and by the sacrifice of a man whose name had nearly been erased along with his family. And children who once dared each other to touch the old railing now crossed freely with their parents on Sunday walks, learning the story of the widow who had rebuilt the planks with her own 2 hands. At 33 years old, Sarah Calloway had stood at the edge of a gravel road with nothing to her name but $4.60 and a grief too heavy to speak aloud, cast out by a man who believed paper and cunning could erase a life's worth of honest labor. She had spent 2 of her last dollars on a bridge the whole valley believed would kill her, and a cabin the whole valley believed held nothing but rot and old ghosts. And in doing so she had found not merely her own vindication, but the buried birthright of an entire community that had forgotten it was ever owed protection at all. She proved, in that quiet, unassuming way her father had once taught her to test a stone before trusting it, that the things the world discards as too dangerous or too broken to bother with are very often the things holding the truth steadiest of all, waiting only for someone patient enough to cross over and see what remains standing after 80 years of silence. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us. walking alongside Sarah Calloway from the depths of her loss to the discovery that changed her valley forever. If this story stirred something in you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a gentle reminder that their own worth is never truly determined by what others have written off. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what is a bridge in your own life, real or otherwise, that others told you not to cross? And what did you find waiting for you on the other side? Until next time, stay close, *.